right, so today I am joined by a friend of mine named Brett Ullman, and I don't know how to fully introduce you because you've done a lot of things. You're an author, speaker, you've been speaking out on a lot of issues for 20 years now.
Yeah, 20 years.
Speaking. Do you want to just introduce kind of how you got here?
That's an interesting story. So, my name is Brett Ullman. I come from Ajax. People don't know where Ajax is. It's about 45 minutes east of the city of Toronto. I was a teacher for about a decade. I taught throughout Scarborough and then left that about 10 years ago because my speaking kind of got to a place where I was teaching full-time and speaking full-time. And I speak full-time. I think I'm on my 11th year full-time, and then I've been speaking for just over 20, with a lot of it being part-time. But I speak on issues that I think we've sometimes just forgotten to talk about as the church world. A lot of conversations on media and really, movies, television, video games, social media. What do we do with that as parents and adults? I have a talk on sexuality, really looking at how do we as Christians help our kids get a biblical kind of healthy worldview of sexuality. And then pornography is kind of part of that, but pornography is so pervasive. I have a talk on that as well. And that's kind of where you and I met. Talk on dating, really basic questions. How do I date? When should I start dating? And that's kind of, I always think sex, pornography, and dating are kind of one big conversation we have to have. I had a talk on men challenging us to be better fathers, husbands, and boyfriends. And then probably the biggest talk I do today is one called The Walking Wounded, which is on mental health. What do you do if someone walks up to you and says, I'm struggling with anxiety? How do we have a biblical but a practical answer to that? Because I don't think we have a good theology of suffering or even a practical application of what do we do with that as Christians today.
And basically, like, I think what you described is you talk about a lot of topics that people aren't talking about. And when you describe, taking a biblical view of sexuality, a lot of people are going to think of the more Puritan idea of, the biblical viewpoint is that we don't talk about it. But that's the opposite of what you're doing. You're going out and you're having real conversations. I've seen you in action having real conversations, with young people, with teens. And when you say biblical sexuality, I don't say you're just talking about sexuality and you're coming at it from a biblical point of view. And that's a little bit rare, I think.
Well, for years, I just said my whole ministry is helping people connect their ancient faith with their modern world. Because we don't sometimes do that. We don't and I love, there are different speakers like Mark Clark's at Village in BC, and he has a great way. He's been doing Matthew for as long as I can remember, but he has a great way to extrapolate from the verses we're walking through to real life. Dating, sexuality, marriage, parenting, and the list goes on. These are the things that parents every night from when I speak, and it's probably the same for you, like people walk up and they want to know, how do we connect those things together? And I think that's what's really hard is that connection.
Yeah. And so I think that the first thing I wanted to ask you about was the mental health thing, because if possible, that is less talked about today than pornography, than issues of sexuality. And so it's also something, though, that all of a sudden I think we're talking about as society a bit more. And I feel like we're a bit caught between, is there a growing mental health crisis, or is it just we're becoming more aware of it? What's your viewpoint on this as someone who's actually been trying to address it?
It's such an interesting question. And I got to be honest and just say, I don't know the answer to that. Probably every time I speak on mental health, a pastor, youth pastor, I'm out for dinner with 10 youth workers. The question is it growing? So I'm 46. And if I look back at when I was growing up, we had a handful of suicides, but not to the extent we're seeing today. And we had people who talked about, mental health disorders, but again, not to the extent we're seeing today. And so everyone's trying to figure out, was it just not talked about and now we're talking about it? If there's less stigma, we're now more open to speak on it. But I also think it is growing. And I think in that there's so many issues we have to address. There's a great blog that I reblogged. It sounds weird to say. I reblogged the other day, but it talked about how we're using language today that's kind of used for the psychiatrist office. So when someone's heading into do a school project or a business meeting, they say, well, they have or they have some anxiety. And it's like, no, you're nervous. They're different, right? So someone might say, oh, look, mental health is growing. Someone said they're anxious. But that's just nervousness. Or someone's going to a party where they don't know anyone and they say, well, they have social anxiety. And I would say, that's not social anxiety. You're heading into a room with a bunch of people you don't know. That's again, just normal kind of agitation, anxiety. Like, again, the word anxiety has so many different meanings. For me, I never really had a struggle with mental health until I had a breakdown. I graduated with a master's degree from Wheaton Grad School in Chicago. And then over the next 5 months, stopped sleeping. And then I collapsed in a parking lot and spent almost a year of my life at home dealing with anxiety, panic attacks, depression. And so for me, this was something that I had to kind of live through. I had great empathy before. I have a talk on I don't want to say mental health. It was more a talk on like cutting suicide, anorexia, bulimia, like eating disorders and those things. And I had good empathy for it. But when I found myself at home, not able to walk 5 steps, 5 minutes out of my house without kind of getting shaky, kind of going, this is new for me. And then the response that Christians gave me was so, everything was just different. People would say, like, have you tried Jesus? And I would say, what do you mean by that? And they're like, Jesus. And I would say, I know Jesus. What do you mean by have you tried Jesus? Like it's a chocolate bar or something. Or they would say, have you tried this medicine? Or have you tried this doctor or acupuncture? Like it's just a million roads and a million directions. And so I spent a long time after I was at home working on a new talk I do on that called The Walking Wounded, where, to narrow an hour and a half talk down to 2 seconds, it's looking at, you don't know what's wrong with someone until you assess them properly. And so it could be physical. So go see a doctor. You should eat better. You should sleep more. You should, do those kinds of things. And then you should see a counselor, like so physical, emotional, and then spiritual. We pray and do other things. But I don't think we address it in that way. Too often we're kind of one of those things as opposed to going through all of them like I think we really need to.
And so we're seeing this whole other conversation, I think, start that also has to do with understanding what smartphones are doing to us, the access to pornography. As someone who's had your eye on the mental health issue, I think for longer than most of us have, do you see a connection?
So going back to the original question, which I don't even know if I answered, is it increasing? I think too often we say like the social media one. So I'm researching 2 new talks right now. One's on loneliness and one is a new version of my parenting talk. Cause I just realized there's so many other things. Now that I have 2 teenagers in the house, I've just realized there's so many things that we need to address. But I just finished a book called Bowling Alone. And it was talking about after World War II, the increase in all these things, bowling clubs, political clubs, like church attendance, everything was on the rise. And then it showed kind of a decrease. And you look at anything today, we have less kids in sports, we have less church attendance, so there's less community happening. You add to that a breakdown of the family. And the reality is, yes, we have some divorced families, but we have a great breakdown of households. And I'm not just saying divorce or not divorce. Just Leonard Sachs has a great book called The Collapse of Parenting, where kids are just raising themselves today. Parents are so busy dealing with their own downward spiral. We have no time to deal with our kids and raise our kids and how we need. You add to that bad food, no exercise, pollution, plastics, pornography, like social media where you're checking phones on an ongoing basis. Like we've always just assumed that these things are okay. We go from no TV to TV, and then we say, well, it's okay. Well, then it's color TV, and then it's bigger and bigger TVs. But we're forgetting with social media that this is still a new phenomenon. It's not like we've had social media for the last 30, 40 years. So what happens to a kid's brain when you do what I think is the dumbest thing ever, which is Snapchat streaks, which for people who don't know, if let's say I send you a message and you send me a message, there's something in there, there's communication. Snapchat streaks, for the most part, is someone just taking a picture of nothing and sending it to someone else so that they can then say they've had like one streak back and forth. It doesn't mean anything. But if you do that 50 times a day, that's 50 times your phone buzzes. And every time it buzzes, you get a quick dopamine hit to the brain, similar to pornography, right? There's something, it just gives you a hit. Well, how does the body and the brain react to something after 5 or 6 years of 100 dopamine hits a day? And as a culture, we don't know. And we're seeing increases in anxiety and depression. And you ask a lot of kids about smartphones, and they say every time they look at Instagram, they feel less than. It's not, I think even all social media, the question is it attention or is it kind of communicate? Like, is it just attention people are looking for, or is it connection we're looking for? And I don't think we get the real connection. We just get images. Like we get a Photoshop image of someone having a perfect dinner, but they don't show that they're alone. Or we see someone out, like any student today will see someone out with friends somewhere, and then they'll say, why wasn't I invited to that? So all of that, you get a dopamine hit, which is there's some chemical issues, and then you're getting an emotional hit to that, which is I'm not there, I'm not smart enough, I'm not good looking enough, and then we have the issue, what do we do with that? And so I don't know if kids can process all that information. I think it was a bigger answer, but I just think
No, that's
things
good.
going on with this that we have to address.
And that's kind of been my view on it in terms of even the question of, is pornography having an effect on mental health? Because it's hard to say. And like you said, all this stuff is so new. How can we even have good and solid research on it? But what we do know about all these things is that they don't help. And so I think about people who do have true, an anxiety disorder, depression, all these things. And so that if we have a society that already has this, that it's not uncommon, and then we add pornography to that, we add social media to that, we're just making people's chance of getting better, of truly getting better, of finding ways to really deal with their issues that they truly need help with. And we're making it a lot harder for them.
And I like what you said. I think we too often look for a quick answer. It's like when I speak on media and someone's like, okay, violent video games. And then they compare that to shooters. And you kind of go, not everyone who plays violent video games goes out and do heinous acts of violence. But we sometimes just kind of say that. It's the same with like Snapchat on a phone. Not everyone who uses Snapchat sending naked photos. Mm-hmm. And it's not everyone who has anxiety and depression who is using an enormous amount of time on social media or dealing with pornography. But you add all those things together, and mental health is so unique. Everyone is so unique. We have to address all of these issues, and we have to address how pornography is affecting you. Even in my talks on dating today, there's a great quote that talks about how can now I know pornography is men and women. This quote comes from the conversation from how does a young girl today find a guy who's not, I forget how they word it. They talk about how does a girl find a guy who wants the slow burn experience, meaning slowly getting to know someone, friendship, fall in love, that when we have guys who are such big on like the next hit of novelty, which is pornography, right? Image, image, image. Now today it's video, video, video. How does a girl find a guy like that? And then how does that affect dating relationships? And then how does all of that stuff affect mental health? Like they're all intertwined for in some way, shape and form, I would agree. Yeah.
So someone who hears you talk and you're talking about all the dangers in modern media and pornography and social media, all these things, they might think that you might be leaning towards being a bit of a Luddite, but I know that you are not like that. You're someone who engages with technology, who's interested in all the advances. You're very active on social media and in using it for good. And you have, I believe, young teenagers of your own. So basically, to wrap up, what would you tell parents that they really need to know about raising particularly young teens in this world, all this technology and social media?
There's a great quote that says, if you can't give it up, you don't own it, it owns you. And so I think that we, as not like, forget parents and kids, like all of us using technologies have to realize that these technologies can't own us. And we have to have some processes in our family. And we have to have, like, even in my own family, I have a grade 9 and a grade 10. We talk about having an hour a day of no technology. And even that's a battle, because in this world today, like, students believe that, if someone sends a text message, you need to reply right away. But like, if you wrote me a message and I don't reply for an hour or a day, you don't think in your head, oh, Brett doesn't like me, right? You're like, oh, Brett's busy. Or if I wrote you a reply, I'd be like, oh, you're doing something with family, or you're out somewhere else. But for students today, there's this great desire to be loved and to be accepted. And in that, they feel if they're not replying, there's something wrong with that. But it's the idea of we need to find a space to put this into our life. Like, I love music, I love movies, I love video games, I love all these things, but it's how can we incorporate them into a balanced lifestyle? It's not getting rid of our television. It's how do we, create good discernment and not watch TV all day. It's not getting rid of our phones, but it's making sure this isn't the first thing that I see when I get up. It's not the thing I look at all day long. And it's not the last thing that I see before I'm going to bed. And the truth is, I'm holding my phone because I'm used to holding my phone, right? Like, but do we turn it off? Like, do we turn it off and have dinner? Meals, just the face-to-face conversation as families. I don't think we have that anymore. And so we, in our house, talk about this. We have a yearly family meeting where we sit down and we talk about everything. I learned this I did a program called the Arrow Leadership Program. And one day a guy named Carson Pugh, who was running it, talked about having a yearly meeting as a family where you talk about these big issues. So we talk about, we're going to be a Christian home. And what does that mean, right? And it's going to mean we're going to go to church, and it's going to mean we're going to address issues and doubts and struggles, right? Like, we're going to talk about those things openly. It also means we're going to challenge music and movies and different things, because as Christians, I think we do life different. So not all music is fine, but also not all music is bad, right? There's a balance with that. It's not like you can only go by quote unquote Christian music, which I completely disagree with. It's creating discernment and looking at music. And it's the same with our technologies. I think we've swung too far in one direction, but the answer isn't just getting rid of phones, right? We have to find a way, and in the middle, there's going to be a balance there, an equilibrium we can find. But I think we're far from that, because we're still, even as adults, I think most of my adult friends are completely addicted to their phones. And so how do we as parents address something with our kids? Like, you can't address something with your kids if you can't deal with it on your own. So I think it's an issue we're all having to deal with, but parents are trying to deal with it with their kids as well, which is even a second layer.
That's great. Thanks so much for doing this. Link for all your information is in the description of this video, but just tell us quickly again, how can people get in touch with you and what resources you have available?
Sure. On my website's just my name. It's brettullman.com. And if you are on that site, you'll find all my social media. But if you click a button called Talks, it will drop down. And I only have a few talks. And every talk, if you click on it, has a button that says Take Home. And I put tons of resources in there. But I think the best place is that on my brettullman.com is a blog. And across, there's a white bar on top. And it will say everything from sex and pornography to parenting, leadership, mental health, which is probably the largest thing I post. And I don't write all my own blogs. I read, I'm going to say 200 to 300 blogs a month, just kind of glean over them and then pull the best information on those topics and then just kind of repost it back out to people. So we post all those things online, and on there you can find my email. And if not, there's just a message or form. You can send me a message anytime. Awesome. And on that site's my tour dates. So if somebody wants to come and hear a talk on mental health or pornography or these things, you can find those as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you most of all for being willing to talk about the topics that generally we're uncomfortable addressing.
Likewise. Appreciate all you guys do as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.